Hello, and welcome back to Full Spectrum Frontiers, the podcast where we dive deep into the intersection of conflict, national security, and the ripple effects they have on society. I'm your host, Bennett Tanton, here to bridge the gap between the complexity of global challenges and the reality we face every day. Today, we're tackling a topic that's equal parts terrifying and fascinating: electromagnetic pulse, or EMP, threats. If you've ever wondered what would happen if the lights suddenly went out, and I mean all the lights, you're not alone. An EMP has the power to plunge us into a modern dark age where your smartphone is a paperweight, your car won't start, and food doesn't magically show up on grocery store shelves. But don't worry, this isn't just doom and gloom. Sure, we'll talk about the risks, but we'll also explore solutions, resilience, and how we as a society can face these challenges head on. Because let's be honest, running scared isn't a strategy, it's a bad workout plan. Before we dive in, I want to remind you to like, share, and review this podcast. Your support helps this show grow and keeps these conversations going. Hit that follow button wherever you're listening, and don't forget to share this episode with someone who's still convinced their generator is an end-of-the-world insurance policy. All right, buckle up. Let's talk about how close we are to the brink and, more importantly, how we can step back from it. Imagine this. You're scrolling through your favorite podcast app, maybe catching up on some Full Spectrum Frontiers, and suddenly, poof, your screen goes black. No warning, no spinning wheel of death, just silence. You look outside, and the streetlights are out. Your neighbor's Tesla, dead in the driveway, and that weird buzzing sound in the air, gone. Congratulations, you've just experienced the opening act of an electromagnetic pulse, or EMP. So, what exactly is an EMP? At its core, it's a burst of electromagnetic energy that disrupts or disables electronic systems. Think of it as a giant, invisible sledgehammer swinging through the digital backbone of modern society. While it sounds like the plot of a B-list disaster movie, EMPs are real, and they come in two flavors: natural and man-made. Breaking down the science. Okay, let's put on our science hats for a second. Don't worry, this won't turn into a physics lecture. An EMP is essentially a sudden surge of electromagnetic energy. This energy can fry circuits, overload power grids, and turn your fancy electronics into very expensive paperweights. It's like static electricity, but on steroids. Natural EMPs come from solar storms, also known as coronal mass ejections. These are massive bursts of solar wind and magnetic fields that the sun occasionally hurls toward Earth like an angry toddler throwing spaghetti. When they hit, they can interact with our planet's magnetic field, inducing electric currents that wreak havoc on power grids. The most famous example is the Carrington event of 1859. Back then, telegraph lines sparked, caught fire, and operators reported getting shocked. Now, imagine that same event happening today with all our interconnected systems. Not ideal, right? Then there's the man-made kind, EMPs created by humans, usually as a side effect of a nuclear explosion detonated high in the atmosphere. These are even more destructive because they're designed to be. The energy spreads across vast areas, frying everything in its path. Imagine a high-altitude detonation above Kansas. The resulting EMP could theoretically disable electronics coast to coast. Why does this matter? Here's the thing. Our modern lives are built on the fragile foundation of electricity and electronics. The internet, banking, water systems, transportation, medical devices, all of it depends on an infrastructure that wasn't designed to withstand an EMP. Think about it. Your smart fridge won't just stop tracking your almond milk expiration date, it'll stop working entirely. Cars with electronic systems could stall. Planes in mid-flight might lose critical navigation. And let's not even get started on the power grid. It's the Achilles heel of our civilization. The scary truth about vulnerability. What makes EMPs so dangerous is the sheer speed and scale of their impact. In less time than it takes to microwave a Hot Pocket, an EMP can knock out systems across thousands of miles. And here's the kicker. You won't even see it coming. Unlike a hurricane or an earthquake, there's no clear warning sign, no radar tracker, no evacuation plan. 1 minute, everything's fine. The next, you're figuring out how to cook ramen without electricity. But don't panic yet. I know this all sounds overwhelming, but knowledge is power. Understanding what EMPs are and how they work is the first step toward preparing for them. Yes, the threat is real, but so are the solutions. And in the coming sections, we'll break down the vulnerabilities in our infrastructure, the actual likelihood of an EMP attack, and, most importantly, what can be done to protect ourselves. So stick around, because we're just getting started. Remember, this podcast isn't about scaring you. It's about equipping you with the information you need to understand the full spectrum of risks and the opportunities to overcome them. Let's talk about the backbone of modern civilization: infrastructure, power grids, communication networks, water systems, transportation. These aren't just conveniences, they're lifelines. And guess what? They're also alarmingly fragile when it comes to electromagnetic pulses. So, grab your metaphorical hard hat, because we're about to go on a tour of just how vulnerable the U.S. really is. The power grid. America's Achilles heel. Picture the power grid as a massive spiderweb stretched across the country. It connects power plants to homes, businesses, and critical facilities like hospitals. Now, imagine throwing a grenade into the middle of that web. That's what an EMP would do. Not just a single failure, but a cascading collapse. The U.S. power grid is divided into 3 major sections: the Eastern Interconnection, the Western Interconnection, and Texas, because of course Texas has its own grid. While this division provides some redundancy, it also means that a hit to one section could ripple out and affect others. High voltage transformers, which are critical for moving electricity across long distances, are particularly vulnerable. These transformers aren't just expensive, they're also custom built and take months, sometimes years, to replace. And here's the kicker: we don't have many spares lying around. Communications. Lights out, calls dropped. Next up, communication networks. In the age of 5G, satellite internet, and smartphones glued to our hands, it's easy to forget how dependent we are on these systems. An EMP would disrupt everything from cell towers to fiber optic networks, rendering communication all but impossible. Think about the chaos of a nationwide power outage, but with no way to call for help or coordinate emergency responses. No Wi-Fi, no GPS, no memes. Truly a dark age. And it's not just personal inconvenience. Government and military communication systems rely on many of the same vulnerable technologies. Sure, some high-level systems are hardened against EMPs, but the redundancy doesn't extend far enough. The result? A nation effectively blind and deaf in the face of a crisis. Water and food supply. The domino effect. Here's a fun thought experiment. How long could you go without water? The answer, for most of us, is not long. Municipal water systems depend on electricity to pump, treat, and distribute water. No power means no water means no sanitation. And that's before we even get to food. Food supply chains are an intricate dance of farming, processing, transportation, and retail. Every step relies on electricity. Refrigerated warehouses, out of commission, trucks, stalled, grocery stores, dark. Within days, shelves would be bare and panic would set in. Transportation, grounded and gridlocked. Modern transportation is a marvel of logistics and technology. Unfortunately, it's also incredibly susceptible to EMPs. Most vehicles today are packed with electronic systems that control everything from ignition to braking. An EMP could fry those circuits, leaving millions of cars, trucks, and buses immobile. Air travel? Forget about it. Planes rely on advanced avionics, and airports are hubs of electrical systems that would be knocked offline. Even railroads aren't safe. Trains and their control systems are heavily computerized. The result? A nation at a standstill, unable to move people or goods efficiently. Emergency services, help isn't coming. Now let's talk about the folks we count on in times of crisis. First responders, police, firefighters, paramedics, all of them depend on functioning communications, vehicles, and equipment. An EMP would cut them off at the knees, leaving communities to fend for themselves. Hospitals would lose power, backup generators would eventually run out of fuel, and critical medical devices would fail. The very systems designed to protect us would become casualties of the pulse. The cascading failure problem. Here's where it gets really messy. None of these systems exist in isolation. The power grid depends on transportation to deliver fuel. Transportation depends on communication to coordinate logistics. Communication depends on the power grid to function. It's a vicious cycle, and an EMP could knock all the dominoes down at once. Why haven't we fixed this? If all of this sounds like a glaring national security issue, you're not wrong. The good news is that the vulnerabilities aren't a secret. Reports from the EMP Commission and other agencies have been waving red flags for years. The bad news? Progress has been slow. Hardening the grid and other critical systems is expensive, time-consuming, and politically complicated. It's the classic problem of fixing the roof when the sun is shining. Until the storm hits, it's easy to procrastinate. What can be done? We'll explore this in more detail later, but for now, know that solutions exist. Hardened infrastructure, redundant systems, and strategic planning can significantly mitigate the risks. The question is whether we're willing to invest in those solutions before it's too late. A wake-up call. The vulnerability of our infrastructure isn't just a theoretical problem, it's a ticking clock. But here's the thing, understanding these vulnerabilities is the first step toward addressing them. By pulling back the curtain, we can start having the conversations that lead to real change. Stay with me, because in the next section, we're diving into the sources of EMP threats, natural and man-made, and just how likely they are to happen. Spoiler alert, the odds might surprise you. All right, now that we know how devastating an EMP could be, let's talk about where the threat might come from. Are we staring down an angry sun, a rogue nation with a chip on its shoulder, or maybe a villain from a James Bond movie? Spoiler, it's a little bit of everything. Let's break it down. Natural threats. The sun's temper tantrums. First, let's talk about the sun. You'd think that big glowing ball in the sky would have our backs, right? Nope. Every once in a while, it decides to throw a fit, launching what scientists call a coronal mass ejection, CME. In simple terms, it's a massive burst of solar wind and magnetic fields that can slam into Earth's magnetic field like a cosmic linebacker. The most infamous example is the Carrington event of 1859. Back then, telegraph lines sparked like the 4th of July, and the northern lights lit up the sky as far south as Cuba. If the same thing happened today, we'd be in serious trouble. NASA has warned that a Carrington-level CME would likely knock out power grids worldwide, causing trillions of dollars in damage and taking years to recover from. And here's the kicker. It's not a question of if, but when. The sun operates on an 11-year cycle of activity, and while we can predict some solar events, we can't stop them. We've had a few near misses in recent years, including a CME in 2012 that passed just behind Earth. Think of it as a cosmic bullet that whizzed by our head. Man-made threats, rogue nations, and EMP weapons. Now let's pivot to man-made threats. These are arguably more concerning because, unlike the sun, humans can be unpredictable, malicious, and, let's face it, downright dumb. High-altitude nuclear detonations are the gold standard of man-made EMPs. By detonating a nuclear weapon hundreds of miles above the Earth, an attacker could generate an EMP that covers thousands of miles. No radiation, no mushroom cloud, just lights out for everyone below. Rogue nations like North Korea and Iran are the usual suspects when it comes to this kind of threat. North Korea, for example, has openly tested nuclear-capable missiles and hinted at using EMPs as a weapon. They don't need pinpoint accuracy, they just need a missile that can reach high altitude. The devastation wouldn't come from the blast, but from the pulse that follows. China and Russia are also players in this space. Both nations have advanced missile programs and are likely developing EMP weapons as part of their military arsenals. And unlike rogue states, they have the capability to deliver these weapons with precision, making the threat even more chilling. Non-nuclear EMP devices, DIY disaster. Here's where it gets a little scary. You don't need a nuclear weapon to create an EMP. Non-nuclear EMP, NEMP, devices, also known as E-bombs, are a thing. They use conventional explosives to generate a focused burst of electromagnetic energy. While their range is much smaller than a nuclear EMP, they're still capable of causing significant localized damage. The technology for NEMP devices is increasingly accessible. With enough know-how and resources, a determined group could potentially build one. Imagine a terrorist organization using an E-bomb to disable critical infrastructure in a major city. It's not as far-fetched as you might think. Cyber EMP hybrid threats, the double whammy. Here's a twist. What if an EMP attack was paired with a cyber attack? Hackers could disable critical systems before or after an EMP strike, amplifying the chaos. Cyber attacks on the U.S. power grid have already been attempted. Remember the 2015 and 2016 attacks on Ukraine's power grid? Now, imagine a scenario where the power goes out, and when we try to reboot the system, we find it's been compromised. It's a 1-2 punch designed to keep us in the dark, literally and figuratively. The odds. How likely is an EMP attack? Let's get real about the probabilities. A natural EMP event like a solar storm is a certainty over the long term. NASA estimates there's about a 12% chance of a Carrington-level event happening in the next decade. Not great odds if you're a betting person. As for man-made threats, the likelihood depends on geopolitics. A rogue nation launching an EMP attack is less likely because it would be considered an act of war, inviting a devastating response. However, the rise of asymmetric warfare, where weaker adversaries use unconventional tactics, means we can't rule it out. A non-nuclear EMP attack or cyber EMP hybrid is more plausible because it offers deniability and doesn't require advanced technology. Emerging technologies. The wild card. Technology is a double-edged sword. On one hand, advancements in EMP-resistant infrastructure could make us more resilient. On the other hand, new technologies like hypersonic missiles could make EMP weapons even more effective. Hypersonics are fast, maneuverable, and hard to intercept, making them ideal for delivering EMP payloads. It's an arms race, and we're in the thick of it. Why this matters. Understanding the sources of EMP threats isn't just academic. It's critical to shaping our response. Whether it's a solar storm, a rogue state, or a high-tech hybrid attack, the threats are real, and the consequences are severe. But here's the good news. Knowing the risks gives us the power to prepare. In the next section, we'll shift gears and talk about what's being done to address these threats. From government initiatives to private sector innovation, there's a lot happening behind the scenes. Stick with me, because this is where we find the light at the end of the tunnel. Let's face it, when it comes to EMPs, ignorance isn't bliss. It's a disaster waiting to happen. But we're not just here to talk about the doom and gloom. This is Full Spectrum Frontiers, where the goal is to educate, inspire, and, most importantly, prepare. So let's dive into what's being done and what needs to be done to prevent an EMP from turning the United States into the world's largest camping trip. Spoiler, we need more than a flashlight and a pack of batteries. Government efforts, the red tape and progress. The U.S. government has been aware of EMP threats for decades. In fact, Congress established the EMP Commission in 2001 to study the risks and make recommendations. Their reports, released in 2004 and 2008, outlined clear steps to harden critical infrastructure, especially the power grid. Sounds great, right? Except those reports largely gathered dust. It wasn't until 2019 that things started moving. President Trump signed an executive order directing federal agencies to assess and mitigate EMP threats. This was a big step forward, signaling that the issue was finally being taken seriously at the highest levels. Agencies like the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, and the Department of Energy, DOE, have since begun working on strategies to improve resilience. But progress has been slow. The main hurdle? Funding. Hardening the grid and other critical systems isn't cheap. We're talking billions of dollars, and let's be real, getting Congress to agree on spending for something that hasn't happened yet is like trying to explain TikTok to your grandparents. Private sector initiatives, innovation at work. While the government grapples with bureaucracy, the private sector is stepping up in some areas. Companies specializing in grid infrastructure and cybersecurity are developing EMP-resistant technologies. For example, some power companies are installing surge arresters and grounding systems to protect key components from EMP damage. It's a start, but the efforts are far from universal. On the tech side, companies are working on hardened communication systems that could survive an EMP. These systems would ensure that first responders, military units, and government agencies could still communicate in the aftermath of an attack. Think of it as a digital lifeline in a sea of chaos. Military preparedness, protecting the shield. The military has long recognized the threat of EMPs, especially given their reliance on advanced electronics for everything from logistics to battlefield operations. Key systems, like missile defense and nuclear command, are designed to withstand EMP attacks. This isn't just speculation. It's built into the design of many critical assets. For example, Air Force One is EMP hardened to ensure that the president can communicate and lead during a national crisis. The same goes for NORAD and other key military installations. But while the military has taken steps to protect itself, the civilian infrastructure it depends on, like the power grid, is still vulnerable. And that's a major problem. Community and individual preparedness, grassroots resilience. Here's where we get to you, me, and everyone listening. National resilience starts at the local level. Communities can take steps to prepare for the possibility of an EMP just like they do for hurricanes or earthquakes. This includes emergency power, installing backup generators for critical facilities like hospitals, fire stations, and water treatment plants. Food and water storage, encouraging households to keep at least a week's supply of non-perishable food and clean water. Communication plans, developing local communication networks that don't rely on the internet or cell towers. On an individual level, preparation doesn't have to mean going full doomsday prepper. Start small. Have a battery-powered or hand-crank radio for emergency updates. Invest in a Faraday cage or bag to protect essential electronics like radios and backup drives. Learn basic survival skills, because knowing how to start a fire is cooler than it sounds. The role of innovation. A bright future? One of the most exciting developments in EMP preparedness is the role of innovation. From advanced battery storage to microgrids, new technologies could make our infrastructure more resilient. Microgrids, for instance, allow communities to generate and store their own power independently of the larger grid. If the main grid goes down, microgrids can keep critical services running. Another promising area is artificial intelligence, AI. AI can be used to detect and respond to grid disturbances in real time, potentially minimizing the impact of an EMP. Imagine a system that can isolate damaged components and reroute power automatically, turning a catastrophic blackout into a manageable outage. Challenges. Why aren't we there yet? As optimistic as this all sounds, there are significant challenges. The biggest is cost. Hardening the grid and developing resilient systems requires substantial investment, and not everyone is willing to foot the bill. Then there's the issue of coordination. Hardening one part of the grid doesn't help if the rest of it is still vulnerable. It's an all-or-nothing game. Finally, there's the psychological hurdle. EMPs are what experts call a low-probability, high-impact event. Because it hasn't happened yet, it's hard to convince people and policymakers that it's worth prioritizing. It's like trying to convince someone to buy insurance for a meteor strike. A call to action. Preparedness isn't just the government's job, it's everyone's responsibility. Whether it's pushing for local initiatives, supporting private sector innovation, or simply getting your own household ready, every step matters. The goal isn't to live in fear, but to be ready, because readiness is resilience. In the next section, we'll dive into what happens if the worst-case scenario unfolds. What would life look like after an EMP event? And more importantly, how would we rebuild? Stick around. It's about to get real. Let's get raw for a moment. What happens if we don't take the EMP threat seriously? If the worst case scenario unfolds, how would life change? And could we even recover? This isn't just an academic exercise. It's a glimpse into a world where everything we take for granted disappears overnight. Brace yourself, because this section gets heavy, but it's the kind of reality check we all need. Day 0. Lights out. It starts with a flicker, or maybe just an abrupt, eerie silence. The power's out. Phones are dead. Cars won't start. For most of us, the first reaction would be confusion. Did the grid go down? Is it a blackout? But as the hours stretch into days, the realization sets in. This isn't a glitch, it's a collapse. Within the first 24 hours, the immediate impacts would be logistical. Airplanes grounded, traffic at a standstill, hospitals scrambling to switch to backup generators, emergency calls flooding dispatch centers that are already overwhelmed. It's chaos, but it's just the beginning. The first week, societal shock. By day 3, the cracks in modern society would begin to show. Grocery store shelves would be empty, stripped bare by panicked shoppers. Gas stations would run dry as fuel can't be pumped without electricity. People dependent on medications, dialysis, or other critical treatments would face life-threatening situations as healthcare systems buckle. Communication would be nearly impossible. Without phones, internet, or radios, communities would be isolated, left to guess what's happening and how to respond. Emergency services, stretched thin and operating without functional logistics, wouldn't be able to keep up. Think of how quickly tensions rise when there's a power outage during a heat wave. Now imagine that on a national scale with no end in sight. 1 month in, a new reality. After a month, survival becomes the top priority. Cities, unable to sustain their populations without functioning infrastructure, would see mass migrations as people head to rural areas in search of food and water. Law enforcement and government agencies would struggle or fail entirely to maintain order. The economy would effectively cease to exist. Banks, reliant on electronic systems, would be paralyzed. Cash would only have value until supplies of essentials like food and fuel ran out. After that, barter systems and local currencies might emerge, but not without conflict. Agriculture, too, would take a massive hit. Modern farming depends on machinery, irrigation, and supply chains for distribution. Without these, food production would plummet, leading to widespread shortages and starvation. The ripple effects, global implications. The fallout wouldn't be confined to the U.S. The global economy, heavily tied to American trade and financial systems, would spiral into chaos. Supply chains for everything from pharmaceuticals to electronics would collapse. Nations reliant on American exports, food, technology, energy, would face their own crises. And then there's the geopolitical angle. A weakened United States could embolden adversaries, leading to increased instability around the world. Rival nations might exploit the chaos, whether through cyberattacks, territorial aggression, or propaganda campaigns. Long-term collapse, a generational challenge. The long-term consequences of an EMP event would reshape society. Rebuilding the power grid alone would take years, even with sufficient resources that might not be readily available in a post-EMP world. Restoring communication networks, transportation systems, and industrial capacity, even longer. For individuals, the psychological toll would be immense. Generations raised in a digital, interconnected world would struggle to adapt to a life without modern conveniences. Skills like farming, mechanical repair, and basic survival, once considered niche, would become essential. Education, healthcare, and governance would have to be reinvented. It wouldn't be impossible, but it would be a monumental challenge requiring cooperation, innovation and resilience. The human cost. Let's not sugarcoat it. An EMP event would lead to significant loss of life. Vulnerable populations, the elderly, the sick, and the very young, would suffer the most. Urban centers would see higher mortality rates as resources run out and sanitation breaks down. Communities that lack preparedness would face the harshest outcomes. But here's the thing: humanity is resilient. We've faced catastrophes before and found ways to rebuild. The question is, how much suffering are we willing to endure before we take proactive steps to mitigate the risks? What we stand to lose. When we talk about EMPs, we're not just talking about technology or infrastructure. We're talking about losing the very fabric of modern life, the connections, conveniences, and opportunities that define the 21st century. It's not just about lights going out. It's about what happens when the light of progress dims. The case for action. So what can we do? The first step is awareness, which is exactly what this podcast is about. The second is advocacy, pushing for policies and investments that prioritize preparedness. And the third is personal responsibility. Whether it's learning survival skills, building community networks, or simply staying informed, every action counts. This isn't about fear, it's about hope. Hope that we can face these challenges head on and come out stronger. Because while the risks are real, so are the solutions. And as long as we're willing to act, the story of an EMP doesn't have to end in disaster. In the next and final section, we'll wrap up this conversation and look at how we can turn awareness into action. Stick with me. This is where we bring it all home. That's a wrap for today's episode of Full Spectrum Frontiers. We've covered a lot of ground: what EMPs are, how they work, the vulnerabilities in our infrastructure, the sources of the threat, and the stark consequences of inaction. But here's the most important takeaway: we're not powerless in the face of this challenge. Yes, an EMP event could be catastrophic, but it doesn't have to be. With awareness, preparation, and action, we can turn what feels like an insurmountable threat into an opportunity to build a stronger, more resilient society. So what can you do? Start small. Share this episode with a friend, family member, or coworker. The more people who understand this issue, the more likely we are to push for meaningful change. Like, share, and review the podcast. It's a simple way to keep this conversation alive and growing. If you're feeling inspired to take personal action, great. Build up your emergency supplies, learn a new skill, or get involved in local preparedness initiatives. Remember, resilience starts with each of us. Thank you for tuning into Full Spectrum Frontiers. I'm your host, Bennett Tanton, reminding you that knowledge is power, preparation is resilience, and action is how we make the world a better place. Until next time, stay curious, stay prepared, and stay hopeful.
It's just you, me, and the odds. We stuck together, we two peas in a pod. You dealt a bad hand, I'm there seizing the cards. We'll never be separated till we seeing the gods. We've been low together, high forever. Long as we go together, we'll die whenever. Be a light, couldn't let the darkness try you ever. Truth in my word, you I lie to never. And when the world gets a little too hard, wipe your eyes, put away your sorrow. When it's war, I'll be leading the charge, and I'll be still fighting for you tomorrow. Yeah, even with a blindfold or in different time zones, could find my way to you with my eyes closed. There's nothing between us. Go to Mars and Venus, stand in front of every one of them rocks. They slinging and being shit. Yeah.
In the fiercest battle, I'll defend you. From all these arrows in the sword I will keep you from danger. Let me be your shield.
Yeah.
You may be facing tribulation, but don't let it get you down. What I'm saying may take patience, but you're gonna make it out. I scratch my own 2 feet to pull you to say